Overview of tariffs in 2025. In 2025, the United States, under President Donald J. Trump, implemented a series of significant tariff policies aimed at addressing trade imbalances, protecting national security, and boosting domestic manufacturing. These tariffs, often referred to as reciprocal tariffs, target a wide range of imports from various countries, with specific rates applied to nations like China, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, and others. The policies were initiated with a baseline 10% tariff on all imports, effective April 5, 2025, with higher rates up to 50% in some cases applied to specific countries and commodities, including steel, aluminum, copper, and automobiles. The Trump administration justifies the tariffs as a response to perceived unfair trade practices, including higher tariffs imposed by other countries on U.S. goods and non-tariff barriers, such as licensing restrictions and intellectual property violations. The administration argues that these measures will reduce the U.S. trade deficit, protect American jobs, and strengthen economic and national security. Where tariffs are headed. Current status as of August 2025, the average effective tariff rate in the U.S. is approximately 18.3% post-substitution, after consumers shift purchasing patterns, the highest since 1934. This reflects a significant increase from the 2.5% rate at the start of 2025. Recent developments. Country-specific tariffs. Higher tariffs have been imposed on countries with large trade deficits with the U.S., such as a 20% tariff on Chinese imports reduced temporarily from 125% for 90 days, 25% on non-USMCA-compliant goods from Canada and Mexico, and 30% on EU goods starting August 1, 2025. Commodity-specific tariffs. Tariffs include a 50% rate on steel, aluminum, and copper, and a 25% rate on automobiles. Trade negotiations. The U.S. has secured temporary tariff reductions with China and a trade deal with the UK, lowering rates on UK steel and aluminum to zero, and capping UK auto imports at 10% for the first 100,000 units. De minimis exemption closure. Effective August 29, 2025, the U.S. will end the de minimis exemption for all shipments, subjecting all imports to tariffs, following the earlier closure of this exemption for Chinese and Hong Kong goods. Future outlook. Tariffs are expected to remain a central tool in U.S. trade policy, with potential for further increases or adjustments based on trade negotiations or retaliatory actions by trading partners. The Trump round of trade negotiations aims to rebalance trade relationships, with recent commitments from the EU and ongoing talks with China. However, legal challenges persist, as the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled in May 2025 that some tariffs exceeded presidential authority, though they remain in effect pending appeals. Expected impacts in the U.S. Economic growth. Short-term U.S. real GDP growth is projected to decline by 0.9 percentage points in 2025 due to tariffs, with long-term GDP persistently 0.6% smaller, equivalent to an annual loss of $110,180 billion in 2024 dollars. Sectoral effects. Manufacturing output is expected to expand by 1.6%, particularly in non-advanced durable and non-durable manufacturing. However, this comes at the cost of other sectors. Construction contracts by 3.54%, agriculture by 0.81%, and mining extraction by 1.5%. Advanced manufacturing is notably down by 2.9%. Global impact. Global merchandise trade volume is forecasted to decline by 0.2% in 2025, with North American exports expected to decrease by 12.6%. Further risks could lead to a 1.5% decline in global goods trade. Consumer prices. Tariffs are expected to raise consumer prices by 1.72% in the short term, equivalent to an average household loss of $2,800–$3,800 in purchasing power. Lower-income households face disproportionate losses, with annual impacts of $1,300 to $1,700. Specific commodities, such as clothing and textiles, are hit hardest. with apparel prices rising 14.40% and shoe prices 15.44% in the short term, settling at 17.20% higher in the long term. Food prices are projected to increase by 4.5%, which is triple the recent grocery inflation rate. Labor market. The unemployment rate is expected to rise by 0.5 percentage points by the end of 2025, with payroll employment declining by 376,641 jobs. While manufacturing may see job gains, losses in construction, agriculture, and other sectors are likely to outweigh these benefits. Fiscal impact. Tariffs are projected to raise $2.60 $3.0 trillion in revenue over the 2026-2035 period, with dynamic estimates reducing this to $2.20 $2.5 trillion. By July 2025, tariffs had generated $108 billion in net revenue, representing 5% of federal revenue, compared to a historical average of 2%. This revenue could offset federal debt or fund other priorities, but adverse economic effects reduce the net fiscal benefit. Is the USA benefiting from the tariffs? The question of whether the U.S. is benefiting from these tariffs is complex, with mixed outcomes depending on the perspective. Benefits. Manufacturing boost tariffs have led to a 1.52.6% expansion in U.S. manufacturing output, particularly in non-advanced sectors, potentially creating jobs in these industries. Revenue generation. Tariffs have generated significant revenue, which could help reduce federal debt or fund domestic priorities, such as tax cuts or infrastructure improvements. Trade negotiation. Leverage. The administration views tariffs as a tool to pressure trading partners into fairer trade deals. With some success in securing commitments from the EU and temporary reductions with China. National security. Tariffs on critical materials, such as steel, aluminum, and copper, aim to protect domestic industries that are vital to national security. Drawbacks. Economic contraction. The tariffs are projected to reduce U.S. GDP by 0.40.6% in the long term, with a significant short-term hit to growth and employment. Consumer costs. Higher prices, particularly for clothing, textiles, and food, disproportionately burden lower-income households, reducing purchasing power. Retaliation risks. Trading partners, such as China and the EU, have threatened or implemented retaliatory tariffs, which could harm U.S. exporters and further disrupt global trade. Sectoral losses. While manufacturing benefits, sectors such as construction, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing face significant declines, resulting in a net negative economic impact. Global trade disruption. The tariffs have contributed to a projected decline of 0.21.5% in international merchandise trade, thereby increasing the risk of a worldwide recession. Pros and cons of U.S. tariffs in 2025. Pros. Boost to domestic manufacturing. Tariffs encourage domestic production by making imported goods more expensive, leading to a 1.52.6% increase in manufacturing output. Protects industries such as steel and aluminum, which are deemed critical for national security. Revenue generation. Projected to raise $2.60 $3.0 trillion over a decade, providing funds for debt reduction or other economic policies. Trade negotiation leverage. Tariffs pressure trading partners to negotiate better trade terms, as seen in deals with the EU and temporary reductions with China. Addressing trade imbalances. Aims to reduce the U.S. trade deficit by countering higher tariffs and non-tariff barriers imposed by other countries. National security and border control. Tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China are tied to efforts to curb illegal immigration and drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl. Cons. Higher consumer prices. Price increases of 1.72.3% affect consumers, with apparel and shoes rising 14.44% and food prices increasing by 4.5%, disproportionately impacting lower-income households. Economic contraction. Reduces U.S. GDP by 0.40.6% long-term and 0.50.9% in 2025, with job losses of 376,641 by year-end. Sectoral trade-offs. Gains in manufacturing are offset by losses in construction, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing. Retaliatory tariffs. Trading partners, including China, the EU, and Brazil, have threatened or implemented retaliatory measures, which could potentially harm U.S. exporters. Global trade risks. Tariffs are projected to contribute to a decline of 0.2 to 1.5% in global merchandise trade, increasing recession risks and affecting export-oriented economies. Legal and policy uncertainty. Legal challenges, such as the May 2025 court ruling against specific tariffs, and frequent policy changes, create uncertainty for businesses and investors. Critical perspective. While the tariffs aim to protect American industries and address trade imbalances, the evidence suggests they are a blunt instrument with significant downsides. The manufacturing boost is real but limited, and the broader economic damage higher prices, job losses in non-manufacturing sectors, and global trade disruptions outweighs these gains for most analysts. The regressive nature of tariffs, hitting lower-income households hardest, raises equity concerns. Moreover, relying on tariffs as a negotiation tactic risks escalating into a global trade war. As seen with threats of retaliation from major partners such as China and the EU. The administration's narrative of tariffs as a path to a new golden age is optimistic, but not fully supported by economic projections, which indicate persistent GDP losses and increased consumer burdens. The temporary nature of some tariff reductions and ongoing legal battles adds further uncertainty, suggesting that the full impact of these policies remains fluid. Recommendations for staying informed. Monitor trade negotiations. Follow updates from the U.S. Trade Representative for developments in trade deals with the EU, China, and others. Track economic indicators. Check reports from the Federal Reserve, WTO, or the Budget Lab at Yale for updates on GDP, inflation, and employment impacts. Business planning. Companies should consider exploring free trade agreements or foreign trade zones to mitigate tariff costs, as recommended by trade professionals. Consumer awareness. Be prepared for potential price increases, particularly in clothing, textiles, and food, and adjust your budget accordingly.